Hey historians, Mr. Birch here, and welcome. Today we're talking 8th grade social studies test practice questions, and our topic is the Compromise of 1850. As always, when you see the question, press pause, take a moment to read and answer, and then press play and we'll go over it together. Let's get started. Which of these correctly describes an effect of the Compromise of 1850 on escaped slaves and freedmen? What is the question asking, first of all? Well, we want to see what is the effect of the Compromise of 1850 on escaped slaves and freedmen. Okay, so let's look at the possible answers. F. Members of both groups were captured under the fugitive slave law. G. Unlike freedmen, escaped slaves were welcome in the gold mines of California. H. Members of both groups could be sold in Washington, D.C. slave markets. J. Unlike escaped slaves, freedmen could vote in the territories of the Mexican secession. Well, what can I eliminate here? Says, unlike freedmen, escaped slaves were welcome in the gold mines of California. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense that they would not allow freed slaves, freedmen, to operate in the gold mines, but they would allow the escaped slaves. That just doesn't make much sense at all. So that one we can eliminate no matter what we understand about the rest of history here. Members of both groups could be sold in Washington, D.C. slave markets. Technically, no, they couldn't, because freedmen were, in fact, free, so they wouldn't be allowed to be sold as slaves. Not that it never happened, but they weren't technically allowed to be, especially in Washington, D.C. Okay, so what do we need to know? Well, the Compromise of 1850 is kind of a big mess. There was a lot to it, but let's kind of look at and try to break down some of the main points here. Texas was annexed to the United States as a slave state. So the important part of this compromise is that Texas became part of the Union as a slave state. Number two, New Mexico and Utah territories were organized and slavery was permitted only based on popular sovereignty. So you'll hear this term popular sovereignty when we're talking about slavery in the states. Well, popular sovereignty just refers to the fact that the local population are the ones that could sovereignly decide whether or not that state was a slave or a non-slave state. And so again, this was kind of part of the compromise here, was that New Mexico and Utah would be part of the Union, but only would they be allowed to be slave states based on popular sovereignty. The local populations vote for or against it. And number three, and this one's kind of to counterbalance Texas, California was admitted to the U.S. as a free state, contrary to Texas being admitted as a slave state. Number four, fugitive slave law required federal employees, even in free states, all free states, to partake in the capture of potential runaway slaves. And this was probably the messiest part of the Compromise of 1850, and maybe one of the most regrettable. The fugitive slave law made it such that anyone that was a citizen of or a government official in one of the free states where slavery is not allowed had to participate, if requested or required, had to participate in the hunting and capture of runaway slaves in their free state. Number five, banning of the slave trade, but technically not slavery itself in the District of Columbia. So the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., the slave trade was eliminated. Now, many of the people in Washington, D.C. who were slaveholders did not like this, but they could still hold slaves. They just couldn't. The slave trade was no longer legal. So based on what we know a little bit more of the Compromise of 1850, what do we think the answer is? Well, members of both groups, freedmen and slaves, were captured under the under the Compromise of 1850. And so here, this part's important. It's basically that no matter what happened, if there was a black person who was maybe a former slave or a current slave who had escaped, who were in the run or were maybe even free at the time, they could be captured. And because of this, and again, that's why I said it's the most regrettable part, is the fugitive slave law ended up enforcing the ability of slave capturing men and women to go and get people whether they were slaves or not. Even freedmen were captured because of this fugitive slave law. If they didn't have paperwork on them, or even if they did, that could be confiscated, and next thing you know, they were accused of being a runaway slave. Okay, the Compromise of 1850. Again, this is kind of rehashing what we already went over, but it's best for us to kind of understand what the compromise was. The Compromise of 1850, it really was a hard-fought agreement. This was a true compromise. The northern senators and legislatures and the southern legislators were so opposed on these matters that the compromise is amazing that it happened at all, but that's why there's some very different things in it, because they had to appease one another. It was a hard-fought agreement between legislators from the North and South. The Southerners agreed to allow California as a free state, which they obviously didn't want. They wanted another slave state to help empower their voting ability in legislative matters. And the Northerners allowed Texas, which they did not want, to be annexed as a slave state. New Mexico and Utah territories were kind of this middle ground where they were slave states only by popular sovereignty. So if the locals decided to vote for it, that's what it would become. The Southerners compromised Washington, D.C., saying that they would no longer be allowed to sell slaves in the United States Capitol. They wanted it to be, but they compromised it. And then the Northerners were forced to participate in the Fugitive Slave Act, and that was their form of compromise. So the Compromise of 1850, just remember that it was essentially about slavery and who could have slavery, who could not, and then the Fugitive Slave Act. If we remember that, we're doing good for the Compromise of 1850.